92% of the world's money doesn't exist. We're all stuck with the notion that money is printed, that someone can just unplug a printer and stop inflation.
Inflation?
We like to think the bank has our cash in some vault somewhere, and that banks move it from one vault to the other when we make a transfer.
It will pass through many, many more hands and withdrawn from circulation.
But the truth is, the money that we use, the money that we have, and the money that we owe, the money that we work for every day, is just an illusion.
Very nice.
But that's not what they want you to believe. Banks and governments have made this so complicated that nobody can understand or question their authority. I think sometimes we're even left wondering if they understand what they're doing.
How much bigger is the market for insuring mortgage bonds than actually mortgages?
About 20 times.
Tech plays a big part in this, and we'll get there, but there were 3 unplanned events, 3 accidents, if you will, that got us to where we are now. The first accident was this guy taking the wrong turn, which basically kickstarted World War I. This dude is, or was, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir presumptive to the throne of Austria-Hungary. And he and his wife, Sophie, the Duchess von Hohenberg, were sitting in the back of the car. And there was a fair share of people trying to kill them both that day, but they hadn't succeeded until the driver took a wrong turn on this street, which left his passengers right in front of this other guy, Gavrilo Princip, a Bosnian student / activist who shot and killed them both. Before the Great War, paper money was just a stand-in for gold, literally. Humans had been using gold or silver to trade for years because it's shiny, scarce, hard to find, and therefore it has inherent value. But carrying a chest full of coins gets unsustainable really fast, and it was the Chinese around the 7th century who came up with this idea of flying money. Paper bills. They were originally issued by merchants, but eventually the Song dynasty monopolized the issuance and started issuing government-backed money. The idea was that a bill represented a certain amount of gold or silver, and so governments would only issue money in representation of the gold they actually held in hand. And back then, you could literally walk into a bank and trade your paper bills for gold. Now, World War I changed that forever, well, because wars are expensive. A lot of things happened at the same time. As the war began, people started running to banks to withdraw gold, but because each brand didn't hold all this gold in hand, there was an inherent danger of a bank run killing a branch. Governments were forced to stop or limit the exchange of gold, as well as stop precious metal trading with other countries. And the simple tactics, like raising taxes or selling war bonds, which is the government taking debt, they didn't work out, so they came up with a simpler solution. They would just print more banknotes. And people understood that something was up, but they maybe didn't understand exactly what, because you could see rationing of goods, you could see prices rising because you had more money in the streets that were chasing the same scarce goods. Now, when the war ended, some nations tried to return to a pre-war gold convertibility, but most failed. Germany in particular faced some of the craziest hyperinflation in history as a consequence of this, and a few other sanctions that they got. In January 1923, $1 was worth about 18,000 German francs. By November that same year, it had skyrocketed to 4.2 trillion marks per $. It famously became cheaper to burn bundles of bills for heat than to buy firewood. People had to bring money in wheelbarrows just to buy groceries.
Venezuela, of course, a country where prices double every few weeks. The government has knocked those 5 zeros off the refurbished bolivar in a desperate attempt to control hyperinflation.
Today, you need this amount of money to buy this cup of coffee.
This instability in the world economy, the Great Depression in 1929, along with a few other issues, they were all part of the fuel to World War II.
By the summer of 1941, Hitler is ready to launch his forces further east. Germany, Japan, and Italy renew their military alliance. All agree to safeguard their common interests. The Axis powers are ready to carve up the world.
Money instability had in part fueled this war, and the Allies were invested in not making the same mistakes. Again, 730 delegates from all 44 Allied nations defined the standard that would truly repair the world economy post-war and establish the US as a superpower. The US had 2 crucial variables going for them. First, that even though they were part of the war, mainland US was mostly untouched by the conflict versus Europe, which was in ruins. And second, at the time, the US held 2/3 of the entire world's gold reserves. The Bretton Woods system established a solid, a tight, and a strict monetary policy based on a single premise, which was tying the value of the US dollar to gold. Now the deal was simple. 35 US dollars would be equal to 1 ounce of gold. Other countries could have their own currencies, but their value would also be tied to the US dollar and by extension, again, to gold. The institution founded by this conference in charge of moderating all of that was none other than the IMF. But that's a video for another day. Anyway, just like before, people trusted this system because at any time, a country could go to the US central bank, federal bank, and exchange their dollars for gold. This also meant that the banks in foreign countries could stash dollars in their vaults, equivalent to stashing gold, except they were lighter and greener. This chart is the best way to see it. For decades, the price of gold is just flat. This time was called the gold window. Over the next decades, European countries filled their vaults with USD as the economies started to recover post-war. And the US was doing pretty well at the time. These are the boomer decades, the birth of the American dream and the Great Society.
From Elvis Presley to the Rolling Stones.
The decade of free love.
The good life meant working toward living the American dream.
Maybe a nice home in suburbia and some nice kids.
But America was fighting a war of their own, and they weren't winning. And again, wars are expensive. The government could have funded the war cutting spending or creating new taxes. But instead, once again, they found the easy solution. They just printed more dollars. Except they couldn't do that.
Why isn't it possible? It's just not.
Bretton Woods required them to have an ounce of gold for every $35. But they were absolutely not doing that.
It costs only a few cents for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to produce a 100 bill, but other countries had to pony up $100 of actual goods in order to obtain one.
The US was playing the rest of the world for fools, and other countries, they started getting suspicious, starting with the French, because there were so many dollars all around, and so many countries had stashes of US dollars, which were supposed to be as good as gold. But were they? Was the US good on their $35 an ounce gold promise? Could they hold on to their word? So this is where we stand in 1966. Foreign central banks had a total of 14 billion USD, again, supposedly backed by gold. Again, at $35 an ounce, which would have been about 12,400 metric tons of gold. Now, the US had about $10 billion in domestic currency, which should have been backed by around 8,800 metric tons of gold. However, the US reserves at the time were way short, 11,700 metric tons of gold short, or about 45% of their supposed reserve value. France started exchanging millions of their surplus dollars for gold, and Switzerland did too. And then on August 11th, this phone call would break our money forever.
Hello? Yeah, can I have $3 billion in gold, please?
The US just didn't have the reserves to pay. So the gig was up.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets. I am determined that the American dollar must never again be a hostage in the hands of international speculators. We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world.
Nixon was officially temporarily pausing the gold window, but the change was made permanent, meaning that from then on, money would be completely disconnected from any store of value. And then money became fiat, not backed by anything, just our trust in the government. And again, you would think that this means freedom to press a print button on the mint, but that's not how money gets created today.
I mean, I could take you step by step to what exactly is occurring, you know? All you have to do is ask.
Now I'm about to explain how money actually gets created today using a series of tubes going from your Fed or your central bank to your bank account. If you want that virtual, I know it's imaginary, but if you want that virtual money to remain secure where it is, you should consider using NordPass to bring your personal and your company's password game to a whole new level. NordPass was created by the experts behind NordVPN to make businesses compliant and to let your team store passwords and other information securely and to collaborate on that with the rest of their team or customers or contractors. 1 in 4 people can still log in to accounts from previous jobs, which grants them access to stuff that they shouldn't have. But NordPass lets you share and revoke access in seconds and have full visibility into who has access to which company accounts, making life a lot simpler for you and your IT department. We migrated our old password manager into NordPass a few weeks ago with a simple export-import function, and everybody hit the ground running in minutes. For businesses, NordPass also features a data breach scanner, which gives you live alerts if any of your corporate data appears on the dark net. And so today we partnered with NordPass to bring you guys a 3-month free trial on NordPass for Business, and at 20% off on their 2-year plan. You can take it for a spin, no credit card required. You can just go to nordpass.com/Slidebean and use the code Slidebean at signup. You can also just scan this QR code. So you'll level up your business security, you'll save a lot of money, and you'll help our channel in the process. So thanks NordPass for helping us make these videos. Now this is the total amount of money that exists in the US, including both physical and digital money. And as you can see, a shit ton of money was created in 2020, and I'm going to show you how it was done. Now, the most obvious way to create money is by printing it. In 2020, the US Mint, who makes coins, and the US Bureau of Engraving and Printing, who makes bills, created about 14 billion coins and about 6 billion bills, which were about $189 billion. However, that only represented 0.001% of the money that was injected into the US economy that year. So how was the rest of the money created? The government, central banks, and private banks all play a part in this, and before you go complaining about specifics, remember I'm trying to cut a lot of corners to make this simple and understandable, hopefully. The first thing that you need to understand is that banks don't use your money to lend it to other customers. That's not how banking works. Let's suppose that you bring $1,000 in cash to your nearest bank and deposit it. What's actually happening for the bank is that they're gonna add this $1,000 to their assets and create at the same time a promise of payment of those $1,000 to you. To them, that promise of payment is dead, technically a liability. So in other words, the bank is saying, hey, I just got $1,000, they're kind of mine now, but I also have a debt with this guy. Now, just like the bank, you have an assets and a liability sign floating above you. In your assets, you no longer have $1,000 in cash. What you now have is that promise from the bank to pay you back $1,000. Now, this idea of adding stuff to your pile of assets and also adding it to your liabilities, this is called double entry bookkeeping, and it's perfectly fine. It's how the world works, but it's the backbone of how money is created today. To the bank, the $1,000 that you gave them, now that's theirs. They've added it to their assets, which means that they can and will use them for something else. And at the same time, though, they must add those $1,000 to their liabilities because they still owe you. And that liability from the bank, that promise to pay you, you can effectively treat as if it were real money. In this day and age, you can even pay with that promise with your debit cards or with transfers. So to you, this is an asset. And that way, promises of payments move from you and to other people, from one person to another. So even though these promises aren't actual real money, they are as good as money. Now, this is partly possible thanks to the third accident in our story, the creation of a promissory note and the accounting understanding of this thing. Now, this idea emerged in medieval Italy, where merchants started using bills of exchange as payment promises. So if a merchant delivers, I don't know, a good old purchase of Parmigiano, they didn't want to have to carry all that money back because it'd be stolen or lost. Instead, what they got from the buyer was a promissory note, kind of like a check with a promise to pay them, which they could then redeem, for example, at a bank. Now, money, actual money, didn't exchange hands yet, only the promise of payment. And these promises of payments could exchange hands, but when all of them are settled, most of the money disappears, and all that's left is the new money that might have been injected into the system by people who are not part of the system.
Good, now we're all even.
These promises were used for years until eventually they started being accepted by governments and they became legally enforceable, cementing them as a true alternative for money. And at some point, merchants just got tired of keeping tags on all this virtual money that they owed or they might have gotten, so they devised a system. Accountants would log those accounts on a balance sheet as a liability for the person who was paying or supposed to pay the money, and as an asset for the person who was receiving the money. This dude probably didn't invent this thing, but he was the first to write an instructional manual about it, which brings us back to today. So let's do that operation backwards now to understand how loans work. Let's say that you need to borrow $100,000 to build yourself a house. What the bank does, believe it or not, is create that number in your account very much out of thin air. It's a promise of payment from the bank to you, and therefore whoever you transfer that money to. So this is now a new asset to your balance, but you've also acquired a promise to pay them back. Now, just like before, your promise to repay the bank is enforceable and becomes an asset to them. You will have to pay them back no matter what, potentially even giving the bank your house. Not only that, but you have to pay that with interest, so your liability is actually bigger than the asset that you received. Now, this loan created $100,000 in new promises of payment, in new debt. But because you can pay stuff with that promise, with those $100,000, well, it's money, it's new money. In other words, your debt, your loan from the bank created $100,000 in new money that will circulate to the economy. Now, obviously, there is a limit to how much money banks can create. It's flimsy, it's not super strict lately, but I'm gonna get back to it. Still, this is the main way in which money gets created today. Depending on the country, 80% to 95% of the money supply is created in this exact way. Commercial banks lending to individuals or businesses, often for real estate transactions. Now, this bank is not gonna print any bills or mint any coins. They're not gonna give you any of their cash that's stored in their vault. They don't come from the bank savings. They don't come from other customers' money. It's a very digital, very intangible number that kind of just appeared in your account. And when you spend that money, say you give it to your contractor who builds your house, you probably transfer that money or pay it with a check. And the bank's promise of payment has now moved to someone else, leaving you with just a liability. Now, the contractor will pay for materials, they'll pay for labor, and the money will circulate to the economy. Most of those transactions will be digital. So in the end, there will continue to be promises of payments even between different people and different banks. But remember, the original $100,000 was created by your bank the same moment you acquired that debt.
It's just money. It's made up.
Now, what's gonna blow your mind is that as you pay back that money to the bank, the balance sheet entry that we created, the bank's asset and your liability, are gonna start shrinking and they're gonna disappear completely. Now, to pay this money back, of course, you're gonna need to collect money from the economy, from your job, from your side gig. So when you pay back the bank doesn't just store the money away because it's a repayment of the debt that they created. So your liability shrinks as you pay, their asset shrinks as you start reducing that payment. So effectively, paying back the debt erases the money. All that's left of the transaction is the interest that you paid back, which you had to source again from the economy. And so that's how the bank makes money, new money or extra money. In other words, the bank injected money into the economy temporarily in order to make a profit through the interest that you ended up paying. If every company, if every government and every individual in the world closed out all of their debts, all of their promissory notes, most of our money today would disappear. Ain't that crazy? Okay, now using this exact same principle, central banks team up with the government to create money as well. Now this time it's the government that needs money, and they aren't building a house, but they're building, say, a new highway, and they're gonna need billions of dollars to do it. They might have some money from the taxes that they're collecting, but piling up $1 billion for this new highway would probably take years, and we need the highway now. And so what the government will do, instead of waiting for the tax revenue to come in, is they're gonna write a bond. Now think of a bond as a request for a loan. The government might create a $1 billion bond, which someone buys for a slight discount compared to the face value of the bond itself. That discount is like the interest that the government is offering in exchange for you buying this bond. Now, lending money to the government is usually a good deal because governments from developed countries tend to be very punctual about their payments, and this makes investing in government bonds a pretty safe bet. It just doesn't pay a lot of interest. Now, while not an exact match, the interest rate is usually very similar to the Fed interest rate that everybody talks about all the time, but we're gonna get there in a sec. Also, you can buy these bonds yourself. Anybody can buy bonds. They're just a good guarantee to keep your money more or less on par with inflation, but I'm not gonna get sidetracked. Now, the government has a partner in crime, if you will, which is the central bank. In the US, this is called the Fed. Now, the Fed, just like everybody else, they can buy some of these loans. Like in our previous example, the government gets a liability and the Fed gets a new asset, which is the bond itself. Now, the money that is put into the government's account is typed in, just like this bank lending you money or you're writing money into your account. Same idea. The money is put into the government's bank account, into the government's assets, typed into their balance, just like with the commercial bank. And so $1 billion are gonna get injected into the economy. That's government and contractor salaries that trickle down into purchases, into businesses, which trickle down into private individuals, into you and me. And so the government would build a highway, and just like you had salary income, the government uses its tax income to pay back the bonds that they sold. And then hopefully, thanks to that highway, the economy grew a little bit, and so the government has now extra taxes to collect. Sometimes though, tax money is just not enough, or the government is spending too much, hasn't been able to save up to pay the bonds that they created. So what they'll do is they'll just create new bonds to pay the old bonds, adding more money lost due to interest and kicking the debt over a few years. Now, this is the source of that eternal debt ceiling debate. How many bonds should the government issue? How much money can they borrow? Should they issue new bonds at all, or just pay back the ones that they have? The balance of all of these things is what creates inflation and sometimes deflation. Inflation happens when the government goes too far. Too much money is issued, and so there's more money chasing the same goods. Deflation is when there's not enough money chasing the same amount of goods, so prices fall. That sounds like a good thing in theory, but deflation also has problems of its own. It causes consumers to delay purchases because they expect even lower prices in the future, which can also lead to the reduction of business revenue, to layoffs, and to an overall economic slowdown.
Oh my God, the automatic pilot, it's deflating!
You might not like it, but more debt tends to mean economic growth, at least for a while.
I don't get it.
Also remember, just like with the commercial bank, closing debt deletes the money from circulation. So there's an even more delicate balance that needs to exist between how much money is issued and how much is paid back between the government and the Fed. Honestly, it's just really fucking hard to understand all of the variables that come into play.
Yes. I still don't get it.
Now, about 25% of the government issued bonds are bought by the central bank. But how about the rest? Well, for the most part, it's the commercial banks that buy them. Now, because the government is so good at paying back the loans they get, those bonds purchased by these commercial banks, they're also assets. The limit to how much money a commercial bank can lend depends on how many secure assets they have. Cash, as in actual bills, are a secure asset, but government bonds are also considered secure. So by buying more government bonds, banks now have permission to lend more money to private individuals, and so the cycle continues. And that, folks, is in the simplest of terms how the government, the central bank, but mostly commercial banks, create imaginary money.
I think it's time you both get the fuck off my boat.
Now, it's kind of crazy to think that so much of our lives revolve around this imaginary numbers on a balance sheet. We live and die quite literally for numbers on a screen that don't really exist. I mean, I'll bet you one imaginary dollar that half the people making these decisions don't understand how this stuff works, but hopefully now you do.
Why don't you explain what that is so they can understand? Yeah, just explain what that is.
Explain what you think that is.
Now, if you enjoyed this video, you should absolutely watch our video on economic recessions and the real culprit behind them. We'll catch you in the next one.